Well, good afternoon. My name is Carl Lissick, Executive Director of South Shore Clean Cities, and welcome to the Indiana Clean Diesel Coalition's webinar on the Indiana Department of Environmental Management's DieselWise 2019 grant solicitation for projects. The Indiana Clean Diesel Coalition, or ICDC, is part of the EPA's National Clean Diesel Campaign, a program combining regulatory measures with voluntary initiatives to reduce the pollution emitted from diesel engines across Indiana. The IDC brings together the collective resources and expertise of our state environmental agency, the U.S. EPA Region 5, private sector companies, academia, government, and nonprofits to address the existing diesel-powered equipment in the state of Indiana. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Shawn Seals, DieselWise Indiana Administrator for the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, Office of Air Quality. This webinar is also being recorded, and welcome, Shawn Seals.
Thank you, Carl. For most of the folks out there, my guess is this isn't going to be your first introduction to a DieselWise Indiana solicitation, but you might see some subtle changes here and there. So I thought there might be some good value in going ahead and doing another webinar with Carl and the Indiana Clean Diesel Coalition. So let's go ahead and get started. For those that don't know, my name is Shawn Seals. I am the DieselWise Indiana Administrator, among many other things at IDEM. We have been putting out DieselWise Indiana solicitations for roughly 18, 19 years now. So we've been doing this for a little while now. We've had some really great projects and some really wonderful successes, and we look forward to working with each of you on the next round. So quickly to go over the overview of what we're going to touch on today, we'll quickly kind of touch on why clean diesel and clean diesel emission reduction projects matter. We'll talk about what grant applicants are eligible for this program. Sometimes those vary. We'll talk about eligible vehicles, engines, and equipment. We'll then talk a little bit about the available funding for this round of DieselWise Indiana. We'll talk about the projects and how much of the projects would be covered through the program. And then we'll try to give you a rough idea of what an application and selection process looks like and what the evaluation criteria that we will be using will be. In addition, there's another slide at the end that gives a rough idea of the schedule of events as we see them moving forward. So let's go ahead and start with why clean diesel matters. Why is it that we are still, after all these years, focused on diesel emission reduction projects here in Indiana? As you can see, and as it says, many diesel engines have already received some sort of emission control equipment on them, but there is a legacy fleet out there that continues to need to be addressed. The reality of it is when we first started giving presentations such as this, we make the comment that many diesel engines have already had some form of emission controls. I think we probably reached a point where we can safely say most have had some sort of emission controls installed, probably by the manufacturers. But these older diesel pieces of equipment that are out there do emit a large amount of nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, and air toxics. And of course, those things matter because these emissions have been linked to premature deaths, asthma attacks, lost work days, and a lot of other health impacts each and every year. Now, IDEM has been working to reduce tailpipe emissions through this diesel sector for many years, and we do it through partnerships that tend to advance clean diesel fuel, engine and retrofit technologies, idle reductions, and much, much more. So for this round of DieselWise Indiana, if you're on this call, whether you're a vendor or not, you're probably going to find a way to be eligible. This is a program that's very open. It is open to public diesel fleets. These, of course, are state, city, county, municipal types of fleets, school systems, and the like. Private diesel fleets, so this isn't limited just to the public diesel fleet side. This can be single owner operators, can be large on-road fleets, small on-road fleets, delivery companies, mining, marine, construction, locomotives, pretty much covers the gamut here. And then this round continues to have a little bit of funding that we'll touch on in a slide or two that's available for public-private partnerships that are focused on alternative fuels. And this is the infrastructure component that has been included in several of the DieselWise Indiana solicitations over the last probably 3, 4, or 5 years, that provides some funding to help folks implement alternative fuel infrastructures for compressed natural gas or liquefied natural gas. The funding source for these does have a caveat that the programs supported by that funding must serve a public need. And a public need we loosely define as a public service that's often provided by municipalities that might even be contracted to a private entity. And your most obvious and common examples are school bus contracts, refuse and recycling collection, and the like. So eligible vehicles, engines, and equipment. What you'll see here is this is a pretty inclusive list. If you've got buses, they're eligible. Medium or heavy duty trucks, they're eligible as well. Marine engines, locomotive engines, and non-road engines, equipment, and vehicles are also eligible. Those that are typically used in construction or cargo handling, including a port or an airport. A lot of times we forget that airports do have equipment that realistically could be considered cargo handling types of equipment. Non-road engines that also serve in the agriculture community as well as mining or energy production. This could include stationary generators and pumps. So now we can talk a little bit about the available funding. So this round of DieselWise Indiana does not yet have any Volkswagen funding rolled into it. So what you're seeing in front of you, this $585,000, is specifically the Diesel Emission Reduction Act, or DERA funding, along with a little bit of funding that we still had available that could be applied towards alternative fuel infrastructure projects. So $350,000 of this is predominantly focused on diesel emission reduction projects, while $235,000 of this could be used for alternative fuel infrastructure projects. So it's possible that those numbers could sort of gel into one. That will depend on the types of applications that we receive for diesel emission reduction projects compared to the types that we receive for alternative fuel infrastructure. We need to have a lower and upper ceiling, of course, in our grant program. And what we're looking at in this round is the smallest grant that we're really looking to award would be in the range of $20,000, with the largest single grant that we're looking to award probably more in the range of $250,000. The applications are due Friday, February 22nd of this year. The solicitation has been online for a week or two now, I believe. So we feel like this is a reasonably adequate amount of time for folks to put together some concept of an application. Most folks knew that DieselWise Indiana was coming, so they're probably already prepared. Most projects must be completed by September 30th of 2019. One of the reasons that it does say most projects is the DERA funding does have a timeline, an expiration date of September 30, 2019. However, the alternative fuel infrastructure project funding does not necessarily have that same deadline of September 30, 2019. So now let's talk a little bit about what types of projects are covered and how much of them would be covered through DieselWise Indiana. So as always, technologies typically need to be either US EPA or California Air Resource Board verified or certified. Verified technologies apply to sort of your aftermarket installations, and certified technologies typically are OEM certified. So those would be more focused on the engines than aftermarket add-on types of technologies. So when we talk about verified retrofit technologies, those things that are like diesel oxidation catalysts, which are kind of irrelevant at this point, but they could be applicable to some of the older fleet out there. Diesel particulate filters, closed crankcase ventilation systems, those types of projects, although rare, would be covered or could be covered up to 100% through DieselWise Indiana. Then when we look at idle reduction technologies, once again, they need to be EPA or CARB verified technologies. Those are auxiliary power units. They may be in on-the-road trucks. They could be in school buses. They could be in a variety of applications. Fuel-operated heaters, those are pretty common and pretty exciting for the school bus community, if you will. They could be battery air conditioning systems as well as thermal storage systems. All of those technologies are designed to allow someone to not run that heavy duty diesel, but have an alternative source for the various powering of air conditioners, heat, lights, and whatever in a vehicle. In those cases, DieselWise will cover up to 25% in the on-road sector. So those on-road types of equipment, DieselWise would cover up to 25% of that cost. And if they happen to be locomotives, DieselWise would cover up to 40% of those costs. Going on with some of the other eligible project types, when we look at another opportunity is diesel engine upgrades and remanufactures. We know these aren't all that common out there, but if folks have an opportunity and an interest in doing those, DieselWise will cover up to 40% of the cost for that engine upgrade and reman. Certified engine replacements, these are relatively common through DieselWise. This is basically where we're just pulling an existing diesel engine from a piece of equipment because the rest of it maybe is in good shape, but they just really want to clean up the power source, and replacing that engine and emission control equipment with something that's newer and cleaner. DieselWise will cover up to 40% of that if it is diesel or alternative powered, and up to 60% of that if it happens to be a diesel to electric transition. We also will cover some costs related to vehicle and equipment replacement. So this is entirely replacing the piece of equipment or the vehicle, not just the engine itself. DieselWise will cover up to 25% of these costs if the fuel source is diesel or alternative fuel. We'll cover up to 45% of the cost if the transition is to an electric alternative, and can also cover up to 50% of the cost for drayage trucks. And drayage trucks, generally speaking, are considered to be those types of vehicles that operate around a port or a manufacturing facility that really don't get too awful far away from the primary source. They're really more about moving the product around the lot, if you will, as opposed to moving it across the state or the country. Moving on, we're looking at the good old days of EPA and CARB verified aerodynamic and low rolling tires. These are no longer eligible as standalone projects like they were formerly, but they can be funded in coordination with the first category that we talked about, exhaust retrofit projects. So if somebody does have a solid piece of legacy equipment out there and they are interested in pursuing something like this, that certainly is something we could be looking at. And then the last category that we talk about here is the public-private alternative fuel infrastructure partnerships. These are ones we touched on a little bit earlier that would cover the cost of the labor and equipment necessary for the installation of a CNG or an LNG infrastructure. And once again, these projects would have to have a public need fleet that is willing to demonstrate either an existing or a future commitment to support adequate fuel volume of the partner infrastructure. The long and the short of it is we don't want to put funding into infrastructure if there isn't a fleet that we know is already in place or is committed to using that infrastructure. In those cases, DieselWise will cover up to 50% of that cost. So let's touch quickly on what the application and selection process might be. This is also very consistent to what we've been doing for several years through DieselWise. So if you've been there and done that, this shouldn't be too new to you. Applications will be submitted to the DieselWise Indiana program via email. We aren't taking hard copy deliveries of applications any longer, so email is the only source through which you can submit the applications now. And on the applications, once again, as always, we have more of a narrative application process as opposed to a form application. Their project is better than some other projects out there. Why their project will really make a difference in their community. We just don't believe that a form application gives that same sort of opportunity to our applicants. Once we receive those, we'll take a look at those. Technical staff within IDEM will review them. First thing we'll actually do is we'll make sure that whatever has been applied for is an eligible project. If it is, then we'll have a few people at least review each one of those applications. They'll all score them independently, and then we'll put all of that together, and that will give us a ranking score based on the evaluation criteria we'll touch on here shortly. Once we have done that, we're going to finalize the funding recommendations based on that score, rank, and other factors. We'll develop grant agreements, and this is the key piece of the process. We'll develop a grant agreement and that is going to be executed by all parties. And the grant agreement is that legally binding document that basically says, DieselWise Indiana is going to provide you X dollars in funding, and in return, this is the project expectation that we have of you. And then finally, once that grant agreement is fully executed, then your grant recipients can begin their projects, but you can't begin that project until the Attorney General's office signs off on that document. So just understand that any costs incurred prior to the signature of the Attorney General's office cannot be reimbursed through this program. The state of Indiana would not have the statutory authority to reimburse you until the AG's office has executed that document on their end. We've touched on the evaluation criteria. In this case, what you're looking at is sort of the scoring that we've historically used, consistent with always, the project's total emission reduction potential, and the level of commitment from the equipment owner operator as it relates to leveraging of funds. These are your two biggest point categories. So the projects that have the greatest total emission reduction potential and projects that have a really high level of leveraging of funds, your funds to our funds, these are 50 points total out of the 100 points available. So you'll definitely want to take a look at these two criteria and focus on doing what you need to do to get those points as high as you can. The third category is the proximity to sensitive populations, such as daycare facilities, schools, nursing homes, and such. Based on where your project is going to take place, be sure to let us know, what is around it, because those things matter, and we won't know if you don't tell us. So be sure to include those types of details in your narrative application. The term of remaining useful life of the vehicle, whatever that vehicle is that you're replacing, make sure we know how much service time that vehicle still has in it. A vehicle that has 5, 6, 7 years of remaining life versus a vehicle that is actually scheduled for regular turnover is going to score better simply because it's an earlier introduction into a cleaner diesel alternative. There will also be 15 points available for reduction in fuel and oil consumption, as well as other fluid and solid wastes from idling diesel engines. And I think this is a good opportunity to score some points by letting us know, how the type of technology that you're moving towards might result in better fuel economy, lower oil consumption, and such. And then finally, the last category of 5 points is the willingness to establish and enforce an idle restriction and use policy. If you are working for or you're in an organization that has a anti-idling or a reduced idling policy in place, be sure to include that in your narrative so that we know that you do have that in place, because we're not going to know if you don't tell us. I think that's the key thing to remember as you go through your application, is to be sure to tell us the story, the full story with all the details, especially those details that focus on these evaluation criteria. And then, as always, there are 10 bonus points available, 5 each, towards Indiana-owned and operated business enterprises, as well as active participants in the MBE, WBE, as well as VBE programs. And that's minority, women, and veterans business entities, so enterprises. So if you are one of those, be sure to let us know that. So then we move on to the timeline, just to give folks, because often this is one of the first questions is, what is the rough timeline? And understand that this is a best estimate, but pretty consistent with what we've seen over the years. So as we've mentioned before, the expiration date is February 22nd, or the application due date is February 22nd. So that's kind of when we're sort of starting that. At that point in time, the solicitation for projects would have been posted on IDEM's DieselWise site for roughly 6 weeks. Around March 8th, roughly 2 weeks after that, we should have adequate opportunity to review, prioritize, and select projects. We would like to think that by March 22nd, we would be able to identify what those projects are and reach out to the applicants and let folks know if their project or their application was selected for funding. Many times what this is going to look like is it's either going to come in the form of a letter from IDEM, or it may be in the form of a phone call from me asking if you're interested in moving forward with your project under slightly different scenarios than maybe you had incurred or included in your application. For example, it is not entirely uncommon for someone to have a $200,000 application that they submit, but we find another really solid project that also wants $200,000, and maybe we reach out to each of them and say, hey, would you all be willing to do half the project for $100,000 each? So sometimes that might result in a phone call for me instead of just a letter. And then we figure around April 19th, grant agreements should be fully executed. Everything now happens electronically and online. Once an applicant is determined to be a award, once we reach out to you and you say, yeah, you're ready to move forward on a project based on those scenarios, we'll walk you through the process of how you get registered with the Department of Administration so that you can get online and make those approvals within the system, so we can keep that process moving. And then ultimately, electronically, it moves its way to the Attorney General's office. And as I said earlier, we expect by April 19, we would expect that most of those would be complete. And then around September 30th, 2019, that's when we expect certain projects funded through the DERA component to be completed, because that DERA money expires for IDEM, therefore it kind of expires for all. That is the long and the short of the solicitation. The details are pretty consistent with what we've done in the past, as I've noted. If you need more information on DieselWise Indiana, you can certainly hit that link in the website. There's an IDEM website link, there's a DieselWise Indiana website link, and then obviously there are various ways that you can contact me directly. You're always welcome to contact me directly until perchance we get to a point that, excuse me, once we start working on reviewing applications, at that point we kind of need to close the door on conversations, just so folks know. All right, it looks like we have one question to start with, and that question is, could the federal government shutdown impact this funding or the timeline if it continues? The answer to that question, we believe to be, it should not have an effect on it, because these funds were made available in the fall, early winter of last year. So these funds, I don't want to say are in-house necessarily, but they are already pre-approved by EPA from a previous allocation for funding. So we shouldn't have any impact based on the current government shutdown.
Shawn, we have another question. And I just want to remind everybody that this webinar has been recorded, and the slides will be available on South Shore Clean Cities and Greater Indiana Clean Cities website. So if you have any questions or you didn't see the whole presentation, that'll be available for future review. Our next question, are EV charging stations applicable for DieselWise grant?
EV charging stations are not eligible under the DieselWise Indiana program. I know there's a lot of conversation out there about EV infrastructure. That is, of course, very closely tied to the Volkswagen Mitigation Trust Program. That is something that we hope to see out there on the street later this year, but it is
dates of September of 19, what the opportunity would be with some of the delays in equipment being purchased by organizations, hence school buses, over-the-road trucks. There is a backlog of potential acquiring this equipment and taking actual possession for an award that's made in April, taking possession potentially by September of 2019.
Sure, that's a great question and a very relevant question, especially today. Considering when folks are moving towards alternative fuels, we have seen that in those cases in particular, there are even more notable delays than there are sometimes in just the diesel-to-diesel programs. The answer to the question, however, is somewhat unknown. And that is based on the fact that until we are able to get an extension beyond that September date from US EPA for us, we're not probably going to be in a position to be able to provide those sorts of extensions to others. In the past, I will say that EPA has typically found flexibility in those dates to a degree, so we're hoping that they will also this time around. Next question we've got, is there a scope for university involvement as a project under this solicitation? Is there a scope for university involvement as a project under this solicitation? Yeah, universities would certainly be eligible for funding under DieselWise Indiana. I think overall, if you look at this program in particular, more than who you are, you should probably be focusing on what you want to do. Because for the most part, just about everybody out there is eligible under the DieselWise Indiana program for 2019. So really focus on the type of equipment that you are looking at improving. That's where that line will be. It won't be in whether you're a university, not a university, public, private, or whatever. Another question we have here is, what should we do if we need help with writing the grant applications? Well, grant applications are not easy. We understand that, especially grants like ours, where it's a narrative process as opposed to just a fill-in-the-blank type of process. I'm confident that the folks here at South Shore will be willing to help you all with those applications. Feel free to reach out to them, see if they have the time and the interest and willingness to do that. I would say if putting together an application is a little more than you feel you are ready for, by all means, reach out to South Shore. You can also reach out to me directly with some simple questions if you have simple questions as well.
Seeing there are no more questions, we'd like to thank you all for attending today's webinar. We are going to be planning some additional webinars in the upcoming months, so please stay tuned to Greater Indiana and South Shore Clean Cities website for additional information on the Indiana Clean Diesel Coalition. And again, thank you, Shawn, for talking today, and we appreciate that very much. So thank you, everybody. Have a good day.